So I have a question for you all. Every one of you have probably been to a fast food restaurant or maybe visit one every once in a while or maybe even frequently in your life. Um, and you ever notice how sometimes when you pick up food from a fast food restaurant, it can be kind of mediocre and just not that great? But then if you go to that same restaurant, that same fast food restaurant, and you pick up food from there, it's actually really good that time. Maybe the food is more heated up. Maybe it's the burger that you got is warmer. Maybe the chicken nuggets that you got are more like fresh and hot and like they were cooked more recently or baked more recently or fried more recently or whatever. Same with like French fries or whatever. But when another time when you get fast food from that same restaurant, maybe the fries are cold, maybe the chicken is a little bit jerky or whatever, feels like it tastes like it's undercooked, or just something like that. But you go to the fast food restaurant. One of the times that you go to the fast food restaurant, you get the food, and it's not the best batch of food that you've had from that restaurant, but it's also not the worst. It's far from being bad. It's just kind of like in the middle. It's just kind of like, okay, this is decent, not too bad. That's basically how I would describe John Saul's The Right Hand of Evil, which is the book I will be reviewing today, obviously. So I've read about 3 of John Saul's books. I've read The Presence, I read Black Creek Crossing, and now I have read The Right Hand of Evil. And something that I notice about John Saul's books, or at least from what I've picked up from people who regularly read John Saul's books, or even, I guess, critics of John Saul's books, a lot of his books tend to have a similar formula, and tend to be, some of them are they kind of blend in and are kind of the same. I would describe John Saul as being like a mixture of Dean Koontz and also like R.L. Stine, but for adults. R.L. Stine, because it seems that, and again, from what I've read from people who read his books frequently, there's always a main character that's a teenager, either a teenage girl or boy. Sometimes in this book, the main character there's a few main characters, but again, in this book, a few of the main characters are teenagers. So R.L. Stine in that sense, because in R.L. Stine's books, depending on whether you're talking about the Goosebumps series or the Fear Street series or whatever else, usually there's like a 12-year-old kid in the case of Goosebumps as the main character, or there's a teenager in the case of like Fear Street as the main character. And then Dean Koontz in the sense that it seems like John Saul's books follow a very similar formula in terms of like the plot and characters and pacing and whatnot. And it's not a bad formula by any means, but it's just kind of the same. That's kind of what I notice with, John Saul's books. They're like you go to a fast food restaurant, like the metaphor that I kind of was giving earlier. You go to a fast food restaurant and like you go there not because you're expecting like a big fancy, great, cuisine dinner. You're just going there for something fast, something cheaper, and something that you can consume and be full and that can satisfy you for a little bit. And that's kind of what John Saul's books are, and that's not meant to be an insult, because I went into this book not expecting it to be, incredibly deep or the characters to be like incredibly like 3-dimensional deep or anything. I read this book because I was feeling something just, quicker and something that was just easier to read and get into, and that's what this was. So basically the premise for Right Hand of Evil is that there is this house. Well, I'll go before that. The premise basically is this family, and they're kind of struggling. It's Ted and Janet who are the parents, and then they've got 3 children. 2 of them are twins who are both about 15 years old, and they've got an infant who's like, I think 6 to 9 months old or something like that. And Ted, the father, is an alcoholic, which was something that was also in Black Creek Crossing, the father, and that was also an alcoholic. And the mother is pretty much the one who is the only source of income, and she's unhappy in her marriage because Ted is a drunk and drinking all the time, and she's constantly arguing with Ted and whatnot. And again, she's the only one bringing any sort of money in because Ted is between jobs constantly and keeps getting fired. And basically they find out that there is this house on Ted's side of the family, and the owner, the aunt, is about to die and is leaving the inheritance for the house in Ted's name. So they're basically moving out of the place that they're in and moving into that house because it's a lot bigger, and I guess they don't have to. And there's also like an inheritance of money that's being left in Ted's name, so they have that. So they're going to move there because, you know, it's better than what they have now. And basically, this house has a pretty violent history, and it's more of a family history than anything. It's not necessarily the house itself. It's more like the family history that's tied in with the house. And so the family moves there, and it's a small town, so everyone knows about them moving in, and eventually they find out that Ted's an alcoholic, and they find out everything about the family because it's one of those archetypes where it's like a small town and everyone knows each other and everyone knows what's going on and stuff. And, you know, soon enough the town is against the family, and then the father wants to make the house into a hotel and whatnot. So yeah, basically family moves into a house that has a violent family history, and things start to go on. There's possession in this book. There's kind of like a religious overtone in this book, but not like incredibly preachy. You know, it's there, but it's not like, it doesn't take away from the story. At least I didn't think it took away from the story. You've got, as per usual with John Saul's books, you've got some graphic violence in here. Particularly, which is something else that happened in Black Creek Crossing. There's even more so in this book. There's actually some animal violence. So if you don't like violence against animals, you probably shouldn't read this book. But if you can stomach it, then go ahead. I remember there was one time in this book where I almost thought about putting it down because of something that was happening to an animal in this book. I'm like, fucking Jesus Christ. So yeah. So that's basically what this book is and whatnot. You know, the father ends up selling his soul, giving up his soul, and so he ends up being like a preferred version of what Janet, the wife, wants him to be, and that's basically how the story picks up and goes on from there when the father sells his soul. And he's basically, it's kind of, at the end of the book, it's kind of left up to your own interpretation, I guess, but I was wondering whether the father was like that the whole time, or if this was his plan all along, or if it was only his plan when he ended up selling his soul or something. But that happens. Then the son, Jared, who was a pretty good kid, both of the twins, Jared and Kim, they're both pretty good kids, but then Jared starts acting weird, and you don't know what's happening at first, but then you start to pick up on what's happening, and then you know what's happening, and it's like, okay, so Jared is possessed because his dad basically not only gave up his soul, but sold his son's soul as well. So I guess spoiler for anyone who, I'll link a comment in below or in the description and say that there's spoilers in this, but whatever. That's basically the gist of the story. Possession, kind of sort of like a quasi-exorcism at the end. So yeah, I mean, basically the setting, family moves into a family home with a violent history and shit starts to go down. So, you know, like as far as like the setting and the plot goes, it's not that original. I think this was released in, I think it was 1999, so, you know, even before that, there was a lot of stories like this and similar to this. Now, a story for me, like, in my own personal, like, my personal taste, okay, a book can have a similar story that's not really that original. It just depends on the execution of the story, or the execution of, like, you know, tropey stories or whatever. That's what matters to me. If the execution is good, if it's done well, then that's all that matters to me. It doesn't matter to me if it's original or not. With this book, I feel like it was done fairly well. I mean, there was definite, John Saul did a good job of creating a creepy atmosphere filled with like just dread and darkness and whatnot. You know, the daughter Kim is more or less kind of like, because in the beginning the main character was the mother Janet, but as the book goes on, the main protagonist more or less is more Kim, one of the teenage teenagers. And she starts to notice like differences in her brother Jared because they're twins, so they kind of have like this bond. But she notices that Jared is being more and more distant and whatnot, and he's starting to change. And so Kim more or less becomes the main protagonist of the story. You also follow the point of view of a priest, like the town priest in here. And I started off not liking him, but then like as the story progressed, you saw that he started to become more of also a protagonist, whereas before he was not an antagonist per se, but kind of like antagonisty. So, as far as like creating an atmosphere and creating that for this type of story, I thought John Saul did a pretty good job. The ending, the ending was a little bit. It felt a little bit too easy, like the ending, how it all got wrapped up and stuff. I don't really have any suggestions for how it should have ended or whatever. There was nothing. The ending was fine. It just felt too quick. It felt too squeaky clean, wrapped up, basically, in my opinion. I don't know. I just felt like there should have been more struggle as to what happened, in the end, and with the quasi exorcism and whatnot. As far as the characters go, much like with like Black Creek Crossing, I didn't feel like the characters in here are not like shallow per se, but they're also not like incredibly deep or anything. Like you got like it's hard to explain because it's like the characters they do have depth to them, but you're also still aware that these are still very much characters that were written. So, I would say the character with the most depth was probably Janet, who is the mother, if just a reminder, but because there was this thing where Janet would be like, she would be talking, having thoughts to herself and thinking about things, and then it would be like, oh, she heard her mother's voice saying this or that, or reminding her of this or that, like memories and flashbacks from what her mother would say to her and stuff like that. So little things like that do a lot, for me to get invested in a character and to know a character. Things like that are what gives a character depth to me. So I'd say Janet was probably the most fleshed out. The father, Ted, felt pretty shallow to me. I mean, it was like in Black Creek Crossing, there was also like the alcoholic father figure who was an asshole. Except the only difference with that one and this one is that the father in this one isn't physically abusive. But he felt like a bit less of an asshole, but he was still kind of like that drunk asshole stereotype, tropey character, So I didn't really care much for his character. I mean, it was mentioned once or twice that he didn't used to be that way, but he kind of just fell into that rabbit hole of drinking and whatnot along the way. So I mean, it didn't really go really into depth on his character that much. Jared and Kim are, again, I mean, they don't really, with Jared, when he gets possessed and stuff, you kind of don't really get a sense of who he was originally, but you see his descent and stuff, and that's interesting, but it still didn't really add a lot of depth for me for Jared as a character, necessarily. Kim, kind of the same way. She doesn't really have, like, a ton of depth to me. And like as far as the other characters go, there's some side characters. There's a character in here who was not a part of the family, but who he lost someone due to the violent nature of the family in the past, and I forget what his name is. He had a mother who was really into voodoo magic, and his mother was killed by one of the members of the family, and it was back when I think it was back in like the 40s or 50s, I want to say, back when lynching was happening to black people and stuff. But you get a lot of flashbacks with him and his mother, and that really adds some depth to his character as well. So he also felt fairly fleshed out to me. So him and Janet. Other than that, all the other characters didn't really feel incredibly deep to me. So the characters are kind of just more or less what you'd expect with you know, kind of like your, you know, middle of the road, you know, horror thriller fiction with, like, you know, John Saul and authors like John Saul and stuff like that. And again, not an insult to John Saul, I enjoy his stuff, but, you know, sometimes the characters really aren't that deep, you know. The pacing to me, I thought, was good. Like, I've heard some people say that they thought it was boring or that it was, like, really slow. There were some slow moments in here, but I was never, like, bored by it or anything. Like, I was always interested. I was always wondering what was going to happen next and what was going to happen with the characters next. It goes into some family history, which I thought was really interesting. There's, like, some diary entries from, like, former people that were in the family who had since died off or been killed off, more accurately. And I thought that was really interesting. So there's, like, a whole family history background. It kind of goes into that, and that was really, like, it was interesting going into the family history. So the pacing, although it was, like, a bit slow at times, it was never, like, dull or uninteresting to me. Like, a book can be slow, but as long as what's happening is interesting, that's all that matters to me. But of course, sometimes books can be slow, and if the stuff that's happening or the stuff that's being talked about isn't interesting, then yeah, it'll be pretty boring. But again, just because a book is slow doesn't mean it's uninteresting to me anyways. And then, yeah, I mean, it's really, as far as, like, any themes go, I mean, there's, like I said, there's some religious, like, Catholic undertones in here, and good versus evil, pretty much, kind of like your stereotypical good versus evil. You know, I mean, there's not really any deep philosophical meaning with this book or anything. It's pretty straightforward. So, you know, so all in all, I felt like this book was it's a pretty good book. If you go into it just expecting a fun read, just a fun, easy read with characters that, although aren't incredibly deep, aren't, like, incredibly weak either necessarily. If you just go in and expect a fun, you know, haunted house story, then you'll have a good time. If you go into this expecting, like, more, if you're expecting, like, something like on a Stephen King or Peter Straub tier level, then you'll probably be disappointed. But if you go into it just expecting to have some fun, some easy fun, then you'll like this book. So overall, I'd give this book probably like a 4 out of 5. You know, there were a few things that bothered me. In the beginning, it corrected itself further, like, later on in the story, but, like, in the beginning, like, Jared and Kim didn't really feel like 15-year-olds necessarily. Or at least, like, what a stereotypical 15-year-old would be like. They felt more like it felt more like reading. They just didn't feel like it didn't sound like what a 15-year-old, it didn't sound how a 15-year-old would talk or act. It felt more like a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old, more like not really a 15-year-old, but that does change, like, further along in the book. That's a very minor, small gripe of mine. Another thing that happened was that a lot of characters seemed to just know what someone else was thinking, like, oh, this character thought something and the other character seemed to read the person's mind, and then that the other character knew what they were thinking. Like, that happened a lot in this book, and it's like, okay, are some of these characters, like, are they telepathic? Like, can they read people's minds? Because it's like, that's what I kept thinking. It's like, a lot of characters here just knew what the other character was thinking, and it's like, okay, like, it's okay to do that once or twice, like with anything else in a book, but if you keep, like, writing that and going with that, it starts to become noticeable, and it starts to become annoying, and it's not good. And yeah, there might be, like, one or two other things in here, but those were the kind of things, just things like with the writing and with, like, a few writing decisions that Saul went with repeatedly in this book kind of bothered me. And again, I mean, it's your kind of your just your standard, like dime store horror book. So, and again, for the just want to repeat again, that's not an insult to John Saul, because I do genuinely enjoy his work. Although I've only read 3 books of his, but I do enjoy his work, particularly the last 2 books I've read, Black Creek Crossing and this. I do think Black Creek Crossing was a little bit better than this, but I enjoyed both. The Presence, not so much, but I might do a review of that one later on. But anyways, yeah, overall, 4 out of 5 stars. I'd recommend it for some easy reading, some easy fun. If you really dedicate yourself to this book, you can probably finish it in like a day or two. I'm a fairly slow reader, so it took me a little bit to finish this, but not too long, so it took me about a week. Anyways, that's it for this one, and I'll be back at you guys soon with more book reviews. So, peace, and have a good day.